Well, we've got an extra special guest, somebody that's been featured in the Wall Street Journal, ESPN, CNBC, and many other mediums. And we have somebody that I actually hadn't even spoken to before, so this is a great pleasure. Welcome, Dr. Bob Stoll from Dr. Bob Sports.
Hey, Chris, we hadn't talked before because people told me not to answer your calls, so...
Yeah, it's par for the course.
I've finally broken down. Here I am because of Ron.
This is going to be interesting because I know that Ron here is, just chomping at the bit to just ask a zillion questions. So we're going to let him start, and he's going to try to run things a little bit. You wanted to talk about process.
Yeah, let's start off about the process. And like Chris said, I said we've got to get Dr. Bob on because his process starts in the summer. You're very busy right now handicapping teams, 131 now college teams with the addition of James Madison. Talk about your process and what keeps you busy in July and August.
Well, I've been doing this a long time. So I guess starting in the early 2000s, I had a model for years that I used to do by hand back in the 80s and early 90s before big data and databases were available. And early 2000s, I had a friend that was a database programmer. And I thought, oh, well, I have a model. You think you could program this for me? He said, sure. So in my mind, there were different levels of this model. So I said, all right, well, here's the way the model should work. This, compensate for this, do this, match the teams up, predict a box score, etc. And so it wasn't backfitted at all. Just here's the way the model should logically work. And we programmed it and it worked right away. And I kind of knew it was work because I had done it, the sort of rudimentary version for years by hand. And I've added different layers to it when it was programmable. And so from that point on, I had, performance levels in different components: offensive run, offensive passing, defense run, defense passing, special teams, turnover, expectation, etc. And once I had those on a yearly basis, compensated as if you were playing an average, Division I team at the time, 1A team or FBS team, then I had ratings for every team going back many years. And at the same time, I started keeping track of returning starter percentages, percentage of running yards returning, percentage of offensive line starts, percentage of tackles for loss, sacks, passes broken up, and interceptions, anything you can think of. Number of quarterback career starts, returning starter or not, returning offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, new head coach, how many years they've been coaching, et cetera. So I have all this data and all of returning starter data, and now I have metrics to show how teams change from year to year and all the different components based on returning starter percentages. So after a few years of that, I can start building algorithms to predict how a component running offense is going to change based on the percent of running yards, returning offensive line, starting quarterback, et cetera. Same with passing performance, et cetera. So I have algorithms now that can start to predict that. And every year they get better because I've added more data. So to start my process, now that I have this, now I go through every team and calculate all the returning percentages and all the different stuff. And then I have algorithms to sort of predict. And part of it is an art form. I think where a lot of the people that are really analytically driven go wrong is they just have one thing, and here's what the analytics tell me, and here's how good this team's going to be. And there's a problem with that because I think what I do, and probably Ron, what you do, and Chris, and since we're older, it's like part art form. It's not just I was a statistics major at Berkeley. I studied finance. I'm really aware of how important analytics are, and that's why I had such an edge over the market early in my career, and still do, but especially early. But at the same time, I recognize that there's an art form to it. You can't just say this is the formula to predict whatever and then just go ahead. Alabama, it's the difference between Alabama having 4 returning defensive starters and Louisiana Lafayette, whatever. I mean, Alabama's got a certain level of play. They're not going to drop off that much, and my algorithm might tell me one thing, but in reality, I'm like, that's probably not right. Or certain coaches produce good quarterbacks regardless of how much experience they have. They plug one in and they're the same. So losing a 3-year starting quarterback for one team might be very different than losing a 3-year starting quarterback. Talking about Carson Strong for Nevada. I mean, that's different. You rarely get, or even when Colin Kaepernick was at Nevada, you rarely get that level of quarterback at a small school. But if you're Alabama, Oklahoma is a good example. They just plug and play. I mean, they're not going to drop off like another team would. So I have a series of algorithms for each component, and I sort of pick and choose and use a little bit of art to try to, kind of give me my final answer to how they're going to change in this particular component. So it's not just one algorithm that predicts everything, because I think that's where a lot of guys go wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could see
Brian,
that.
You don't have a question from all that, do you?
Yeah, maybe 10 or 12.
You touched on about 10 different things I want to talk about, but go ahead, Brian.
No, I'll make it real quick. Like a team like Clemson, I think that I kind of see, Clemson had maybe 2 6-round draft choices for the NFL. That means they're probably returning people, whether they're on the team now or not, are better than what they had last year, because they're used to having a lot of people drafted by the NFL. So you can pick up different nuances that way.
Yeah, last year was good. Speaking of Clemson, I had them further down than almost anybody at the beginning. I had them 11th at the beginning of last season, and I had Georgia number 1 going into the year. That worked out. And I Clemson much like, especially the offense, and it was not that I didn't believe in the quarterback, because he had played, against Notre Dame in a couple games where he took over as a starter for Lawrence and did just as well as Trevor Lawrence did. The problem was the receiving group was not as good based on the stuff that I do, and they lost their running back, who was he's in the NFL now, but in 2020 and 2019 he averaged like 10 yards per target out of the backfield. And the rest of the Clemson running backs out of the backfield for the previous 3-4 years, it averaged about 6 yards per target. So there's a guy that was getting like 70 targets out of the back. I think it was Spiller, man, it might have been Spiller. About 70 targets out of the backfield, and a difference of 4 yards per target, 280 yards over. That's 2 points a game right there over the course of 12, 13, 14 games. Plus the receivers that they lost were their most explosive receivers. Ross was coming back from injury. I didn't think he'd quite be the same as he was before. So I had marked down their passing offense, and they were even worse than I thought. I do think this year they've had time to replenish. The younger receivers had another year. They will certainly be improved, to your point. They didn't lose the talent that they normally lose. The defense is going to be great like it always is. The offense will be improved. I still don't think they're the level of 4th, 3rd. I don't think you can just plug them back into the top 5 again, but they're certainly a top 10 team.
Chris?
You're just chopping at the bit, but I'm going to combine 2 questions for you, Bob. You kind of touched on the evolution of your, along the way sort of thing, but compared to the 20 years ago, how different is your model and your process with these things? And are there any suggestions on, I get a lot of people to contact me and they want suggestions on how to start a model. Obviously Google is one way, but applying it toward what we do, any suggestions that you would have for them?
Yeah, well, I'll end with that. The first thing about how it's changed, obviously there's more data available. I've always been good in college, and the model that I had 20 years ago, the way the model is formed is pretty much the same, and I've added variables over time to enhance the predictability of it. And the NFL, I had the same sort of model, and it worked great for the first 15 years of my career. I've been in business 35 years. Then I hit a lull for about 10 years. I was like 52%. I honestly was spending more time in college than I was in the NFL, and I didn't really update my NFL model that much. So I quit the NFL for 3 years, and I thought, well, I need a model based on advanced metrics, play-by-play data, success rates, all that different stuff that goes into that. I just don't have the capability to do it right now, and I'm so focused on college and then basketball. So I just suspended NFL for a few years, and then I had an opportunity to hire someone. And that first year, we worked on the foundation of a model and just getting all that data. He was with me for 1 year, and then I hired a young mathematician out of the University of Kansas, and we've been working together ever since. In the 6 years of this play-by-play model that I have, it's been 58% on best bets and 56% on what I call strong opinions. So the not quite best bets. I mean, we were hoping for 55, 56% long run, and it's been beyond that. And so it's changed because the data I'm using, especially in the NFL, it's not rushing yards, passing yards, yards per play, none of that stuff. It's success rates, EPA per play, explosiveness, big play percentages, just all kinds of things that go into blocking win rates, pass rush win rates, stuff like that. All the stuff that goes into the NFL model is so advanced and so different. Terms I never heard of 20 years ago are now driving the NFL model. Now, I have since hired another young mathematician from MIT as an intern this summer, and we're working on the college football version of the NFL model, which has been so good. So I'm going to combine. My college model has been really good picking sides, and it was again last year. I had a sort of down year overall on picking games, but it was all on totals. My sides were still good. The totals were terrible, and so this model is going to help me, with totals, hopefully. So now I'm going to have two models. I have an advanced model based on modern metrics, and then the old model, which has worked well over the years for sides and continues to work well. Now, as far as what I'd recommend, I think the first mistake people make is, even advanced people, like people who understand statistics, all right, well, I've got all these stats. I'm going to get a regression model, and I'm going to try to find out what matters, what predicts point differential. It's a good way to start. That's the way I started. And what they'll find is, let's just talk the NFL, and college applies too, but turnovers. Wow. All right. Turnovers are really key in winning and losing. Yes, they are, but they're not that predictive. So people get they get the mistake of overweighting turnovers. The problem is past turnovers don't correlate very highly to future turnovers. So if you got a model that's based heavily on turnover season to date, you've got a contrary model. You've got a model that's probably going to lose 52% instead of win. Mm-hmm. Because you're overweighting past turnovers. And that's the mistake that most people make when they say, I've got this model and here it is. I'm like, the keto model is finding where the variance is in football, fumbles especially, turnovers in general. Obviously, there are some quarterbacks who don't throw as many interceptions. That can be, but there's still variance in that. You could have a guy that's completing 68% of his passes and only gets 10% of his passes defended against, which would be about a 2.1% interception rate. And he might be throwing 3% interceptions randomly. And you think, he's an interception prone. No, that's probably not going to happen going forward. If he's completing close to 70% of his passes, he's not going to throw 3% interceptions. So the things you can predict interceptions with, passes defended is one of them. Fumbles, the only thing that really predicts fumbles is sack rate. The rest of the stuff's random. So once you figure out what the variance is, and in basketball, it's 3-point shooting percentages, the team shoots 45%. There's nothing you can do. I mean, they might be a 32% 3-point shooting team and knock down 45% one game, and you just lost the game that you should have won by 15. Maybe you lost by 2 because of the 3-point variance. So what you need to do is find where the variance is and then take it out. Find a model that gets to the root of how good teams are. In football, success, or how many of your plays are successful, meaning how many of your plays are positive EPA, expected points added. What percentage? An 80-yard screen pass to a running back out of the backfield that he takes for 80 yards is not that predictive. It's a successful play that might go for 10 yards normally or 8 yards. But if you're counting yards and you see an 80, at the end of the day, you see a quarterback had 300 yards on 30 passes, and you're like, 10 yards a pass, that's great. Well, you take out that 180-yard screen pass, and then you're talking about 7 1/3 yards per pass, which is pretty mediocre. I mean, you have to understand the context of what you're looking at when you're just looking at statistics. So success rates do that. They take out the randomness in big plays. Now, big plays are part of the puzzle, but they're not as predictive as success rates. So stuff like that, you have to be aware of the variance and try to find ways to take it out or predict those things that are variable in a more realistic way going forward.
Yeah, just quickly before we go to Ron, I noticed that you had a banner 2020, and similarly to me, in both years, mediocre year 2021. So just quickly, I felt whatever we're doing, I feel guilty for how my model works compared to the detail that's involved in yours. But do you think 2020 was extreme variance our way? 2021, I felt, was extreme variance against, which was to be predicted. I just want to see it get back to normal. Did you find anything? Do you feel the same way? And I feel confident that next year is going to be great.
Yeah, well, and if you're speaking of the NFL, because my college was pretty solid last year. So in the NFL last year, I was 43-43. In 2020, what you're speaking about, I was 59-27.
Yeah.
So a 69%, like an all-time great year.
That year, 69% too.
Yeah, that year, and maybe you did. Obviously the predictive metrics that we're both using worked, but I also was 12-6 on close games, and I had some turnover margin luck.
Yeah.
And last year was just the opposite. I was 43-43. I was profitable because my bigger plays won. So I was 3.5 units up despite the 50% record. The bigger plays won, which is nice. But the difference was I was something like 3-9 or 3, something on close games I lost.
Yeah.
I lost the turnover margin in the games that I bet. So it's just the opposite of that. And it's funny that people say, oh, maybe the market's caught up to you. I'm like,
no.
Yeah, but a year before, I destroyed the market. So you can't say going after 2020 or 69%, I've got the secret sauce and I'm going to be 69% forever. I knew that wasn't going to be the case. I wrote my clients and said, look, we're 59% long-term in the NFL after a great year. Expect more of the 57, 58% long-term, which is better than you would have suspected. But after 6 years of this model, I know, we're 58% and the smaller plays are good too. You can now start to expect that going forward. So even after this year, same thing. I'm not going to hit 69% like I did in 20. I'm not going to hit 50% like I did last year. It's going to be in that 56, 58% range most likely, which is great. That's world class, as you know. And the thing about amateurs are like 56%, that doesn't even cover the juice. And I'm like, what kind of math are you doing?
Yeah.
You're paying minus 130 juice. I don't know. Minus 110, it's 11 divided by 21, 52.4%. But they go, yeah, but that's only 3% better than. I'm like, no, but every percent better than 52.4, you're picking up 2.1% return on investment. Plus, it's compounded. People really need to understand the math. If you go to my website, you'll see all kinds of articles on money management and the math of it all, which I recommend if you have no idea what I'm talking about. But 55, 56% is world class, and there aren't that many people who can do that in the long run. So it amazes me how amateurs think that that's not good. And they're like, okay, I'll see you down the line in 5 or 6 years. Maybe you don't need me now, but you're going to realize that you have no idea what you're doing, basically.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ron. Go ahead. Want to announce
the metrics is a great way. So this is a good time to pivot into areas that I used to be more involved in, and maybe you too, situational handicapping. And I found that team trends and other trends like that are really going by the wayside. Now, for me, it's going by the wayside because there's too many coaching changes. There's too many portal movements. There's a lot of other factors, but some of the things I still value would be 2 weeks to prepare for an option attack, for example. Are there some situational factors that you can still value or value more than others, or where are you in terms of situational handicap?
Yeah, early in my career, I did a lot of this, and it started when I was in college at Berkeley. I got in a football pool, and I got interested in picking against the spread. I never knew what a spread was at the time, but I won the pool my first week. I was 12-2 against the spread, won $102 for my $2 entry. I was like, this is sweet. The next week I came in second, won $40. And had I not been that successful, then I may have never continued on. But then I started really getting into it and developing models. And at the same time, I was taking a time series analysis class, which is basically a way to discover patterns that aren't linear. Weather is a good example. Temperature is a good example. It goes up and it goes down and it goes up and down. So to track the consistency of something or to predict something like that, you use sines and cosines or frequencies, waves. And so it's like linear regression, but with frequencies or with sines and cosines. And so I thought that's interesting because I've always noticed as a Raider fan, as soon as I think the Raiders can't lose because they've played great 3 or 4 weeks in a row, they end up losing to a team that sucks. And I'm like, what the hell's going on? So the first thing I did is I plugged in all the Raiders information for like in the mainframe at Berkeley for the last like previous 5 years. And I'm like, oh, they actually do have patterns. They have like a bi-weekly pattern. They have a sort of a semi-seasonal pattern. So I just by hand plugged in all the rest of the scores and did a compensation on how good each game performance was. And I found the same sort of patterns for all that applied sort of to all teams. And that got me thinking about the patterns, league-wide patterns. You mentioned team patterns. There used to be some that I used to do years ago. The 49ers off a loss during the Montana and Young days. Pittsburgh Steelers had a lot of patterns because they had coaching consistency and the same identity. Patriots had patterns that worked off a loss, fantastic. A revenge against the team that Belichick previously lost to, fantastic. And that might have been a Brady thing too. But very few team trends. But what I did over time is as I developed these patterns, these situations, as I call them, I started keeping track. Anything that I do, I don't assume works. I want to test it. So I'd say, okay, each game, every sport, I have situations or patterns that I run that pop up, and I'm like, okay, this game, this is a 3 for the home team, a +3, and I do it on a scale of -5 to +5 in terms of the home team, and I write down what I think how strong the situation is for the team. And over the years, then I've been able to track. Well, I've got a bunch of 5s; they win at this percent. I got a bunch of 4s; they win at this percent. 3, and over the years now, I haven't. People dismiss trends like that as if that's just a bunch of hooey. Well, team trends are, and this team is 8-2 against the spread on week 3. That's a bunch of that's crap, right? But league-wide patterns, teams that win and cover the spread 3 weeks in a row in the NFL, then go on the road against the winning team. That's only been 38% or so against the point spread for 40 years. Stuff like that. That's stuff. That's a letdown spot. You've won and covered 3 weeks in a row. The public starts to over. The point spread's a price. And if people think you're better than you are because you've happened to win and cover 3 or 4 weeks in a row, the price to bet on that team is going to go up. And chances are maybe they're letting down, or the other team is looking and saying, what are they doing that's so successful, and what can we do to stop that? So there's a lot of things that go into why after 3 or 4 weeks you'll see an NFL team playing great and then they'll drop off a little bit. And some of those patterns still work. They don't work as well as they used to in the NFL because the odds makers have gotten wise. They don't adjust the spreads to public perception as much as they used to. When the spread was based on public perception back in the 80s and 90s,
lucky dog,
trends won a lot because they were contrary mostly against what the public would think would be the thing. Bet against the hot team, bet on the team that sucks. Those kind of things worked in the NFL and still do it to a degree, but not like they used to. But I've charted this over the years, and I know exactly how much if I give a 4 rating on a situation, I know enough that's nowadays it's probably like 53% in the NFL, let's say, right, where a 5 is pretty rare, and those are still hitting 56, 57% long term and still work. But I'll know I don't bet a game based on a situation anymore, but I will pass a game that my model likes the other side of if a situation that is significant is on the other side. If I've got a 4 or 5 rating on a situation going against my model, I'll pass, and I keep track of that too. What's the record of the model plays I've passed on due to the situation? It's 50%. So I've been right to pass on those games. So people say, well, situational stuff, that's a bunch of crap. Well, no, it works. It's worked for me. And I don't just assume it works. I've charted it for 30 years. I know exactly how well these things predict based on how I rate, based on my ratings of the situational strength of a certain game. So, people will still argue with me. I'm like, have you tracked it for 30 years? Do you know what, they just attack it like it's nonsense. It's not nonsense. It still factors in to a degree, not like it did in the 80s and 90s, but it still works to a degree. And it depends on the sport. Some sports, it doesn't really work much anymore, but the NFL still has some value in that kind of stuff.
I know Ron spends a lot of time backtracking with his histories. Why don't you talk about that, Ron, and compare that a little bit?
Well, I really track rowing data for teams, especially teams. Let's say Bill Snyder is the Kansas State coach. You know that year after year, they're going to run the same scheme. They're going to plug in the JUCOs and so on. I've got running data for them. I've got their power ratings. I've got my own personal performance on them. How many times were they projected to win the line of scrimmage? Especially back in the Ivy League days, line of scrimmage meant everything in college.
Yep.
And what Chris is alluding to on a more global factor is the fact both Chris and I can easily tell you as well, we track everything we do. So we know, that things work or don't work and so on. And the purpose of these videos, in some respect, is to have people understand how important it is to self-critique and so on.
Yeah.
So, you could probably elaborate on the point as to why you do all this back research and why you try to come up with new angles when like the odds makers adjust.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, yeah. If something is in my handicapping process, in my thinking, I want to know if it should be a part of my process, and I want to test it, because if it doesn't work, then I don't have to worry about it anymore. If I'm passing an otherwise good bet because of something that I think is important, and then I find out it's not important, well, then I don't have to, that's not keeping me off bets, because now I know. What I find with a lot of guys that start betting is, and I hear it all the time, like, oh, how good are you? I'm like, I'm 55% over 30-something years in college football. My NFL has been better than that recently. Like, oh, that's not that good. I'm like 60%. I'm like,
yeah.
No, you're not.
Yeah.
I go, do yourself a favor. Write down every bet you make and put it in a spreadsheet and put a 0 or a 1 or a 0.5 if it tied, and find out how good you are. Because what they're doing is no, I'm 60% because the game they should have won, the bad beat that went against them, or the team scored in the last minute to backdoor me or whatever. They consider those wins in their mind, even though they weren't.
I should have won.
But they don't think about the ones they should have lost but won. They think those are wins.
That's for
and
sure.
So in their mind, they think they're 55, 60%, but in reality, they're not counting the lucky wins. They're only like, I got bad beat and should have won that, so I should be 60%. Write down every single bet you make. And if you're a handicapper, if you're an amateur handicapper, and come up with columns as to why you bet it. Power ratings, let's say, or I like the matchup, or there's a good trend, or whatever it is. So you have different matchup, power rating, trend, whatever it is, whatever the factors that you have in evaluating a game, coaching mismatch, whatever it is. Have columns for everything. Put ones into all that applies to the reason you made that bet, and zeros on the ones that don't. Over time, and whether it won or lost, over time, you'll start to understand what part of your process works and what part of your process doesn't, and eliminate the things that don't work or haven't worked. And this might be 2 or 3 years. Don't do it after 10 weeks or a year. Yeah. After a few years, you'll have a good idea of, what I think is a good matchup, well, that doesn't matter at all. I don't know anything about matchups, apparently. I'll just stop I'll stop keeping track of that. I'll stop letting it sway me. So everything you do, every bet you make and why you made them that's my biggest advice to someone who's an amateur handicapper. If you have a method, track it.
Yeah. That's just amazingly solid. I mean, I can't, it's amazing how you've touched on so many great points. We've seen the evolution of NFL season wins and probably NCAA kind of change and evolve as people learn you can't just base it off of last year. And with the Pythag coming out and openly. So those are kind of tighter. A different area that I think is under appreciated is strength of schedule. The perception of strength of schedule has changed a few times. And you just can't look at the teams that these teams played. I'm sure you do something similar that I do, where you're looking at the exact situation where you're marking down that, we've got to increase this value of this particular win or decrease it based on these factors. So just a short comment on that, on how deep you do go on those adjustments. And then secondly, how does the market come into play with your process? Do you have confidence in your numbers and you don't concern yourself with the market, or do you kind of put your thinking cap on to try to determine why the market moved?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like some people, some people say, well, I don't want to go if the market's already moved like 2 points in a college game. I've lost the value. And I don't, well, if my model says the line should be 7 and it opened at 3.5 and went to, opened at 3 and went to 4, and I think it should be 7, I don't care that it's moved from 3 to 4.
Right.
That's probably
would you reduce your bet on it?
What's that?
I'm sorry. Would you reduce your bet because you were getting a different line?
Oh, yeah. I mean, probably it wouldn't be as big because I have less value, but it doesn't mean I'm not betting it because I've already lost the line value. Yeah. I mean, it could still be a good bet, and it could just be that, just because the initial move is not necessarily the full move or how much it should be. Okay. And I don't necessarily say, well, I don't want to go against the market. So-and-so sharp better went the other way. I don't care. Now I've got more value and I trust my process. What I might do if I find out that a handicapper that I respect that has a good long-term record has gone the opposite way of what I've gone, I might look into it a little bit more and say, why is that the case? Where am I showing the value? And look at that again, examine that again and be like, and either be, no, I'm sure that what I've come up with is good. I'm going to go with it. Or, I see, okay, maybe I need to alter that a little bit, or maybe I need to pay more attention. I can understand this bet, and maybe there's reasons why I need to lower or change my rating on a team. So line movement doesn't bother me necessarily. If it's a line movement from someone I respect, then I'll examine what I'm doing, but it's not going to scare me off of what I do. What I do has worked for a long time and still does. You mentioned win totals.
Strength of schedules.
Yeah, strength of schedule. Here's the thing. I think my model, and this is why I've been so good in college over the years, my methodology is particularly good at adjusting for strength of schedule. So I am particularly good in weeks 4, 5, 6, 7, like early in the conference season. Yeah. 2 teams might square off where one has played a bunch of MAC teams and one has played a bunch of other Power 5 teams. I've got a pretty good idea how good these teams are, regardless of their strength of schedule. I think teams that beat up on bad teams sometimes don't get the credit that they deserve for doing that. I'm compensating for all this stuff. I'm adjusting for strength of schedule. And if I'm showing they're legitimately good team, or maybe especially better than I would expect that they've done against those teams, I'm not afraid to bet on a team that's beaten up on a bunch of patsies just because now they're playing a legitimate team that's played a bunch of tough games. I mean, I've adjusted for all that. So I trust my model. I don't weigh one game more than another. As the season goes on, I will look at how a quarterback is done against, if they're playing a really good pass defense, I'll look to see how that team's done against other good pass defenses, understanding that it may only happen 3 times and there's variance in that. You can't put too much weight on 3 games. I'd rather have weight on the 9 games they've played more than the 3 games they've played against a good defense. But I will weigh it a little bit. I have mathematical things that I can do that can kind of give a little more weight to that. Especially if they, if a team's, average like 12 yards per pass play against some team, which is even compensated or adjusted much better than normal, I will dampen the effect of that particular game. Like I'll use a median compensated level instead of, which gets rid of the outlier. So I do those things, and I adjust my math accordingly. But strength of schedule is cooked into my model, so I've done pretty well with that. And you mentioned the season win totals in the NFL. There's still some value there, and our simulation's done pretty well picking when there's not as much value as there used to be. To your point, but in college I went 11-0 on the win totals last year. So
nice. Yeah.
I'm 47-20. What is it? 47-20 lifetime on win totals, or 46-23 or something like that. I have it somewhere, but 11-0 last year. So there's a lot of value in my priors. My priors are very, very good, and my win totals have been really good for a lot of years. So I look forward to that. They come out in about a week, I guess, week and a half.
Ron, fire away.
all the work you do, and I'm with you there. I actually have like 40 or so college season win totals, picking off lines and looking at value and so on. And then there's week one. And I think I read something, now this could have changed because it was several years ago, that you wrote where you didn't have a lot of week one bets. And I've been asked that question too. How come you don't have a lot of week one bets? You seem to have a lot of knowledge going in.
Yeah.
What's your philosophy as far as week one in a season?
What I should be is betting more of them, because my ratings do actually do pretty well in week one. I hate the uncertainty of it.
Yeah, I know.
I don't have any data, and it bugs me, even though I spent all summer doing this analysis, and I know my priors are good because my win totals are really good, that I still don't put. And I know that if I have a certain differential between my ratings and the line in week one, I've tracked those for years. I know they win, and I still have a hard time pulling the trigger on those for some reason. And maybe I just need to get over that. It's just, as a mathematician, it's lack of data. It's just, it's a lot of not guesswork what I do with my preseason ratings, because obviously they work, and I put a lot of math into those as well. I should be betting more of them. And last year I had a few, and they won. I actually had one of my over teams, Syracuse, win total playing Ohio, which was one of my biggest under win total bets. They played in week one. And so, all right, well, I had to bet that one. It'd be kind of silly if I don't, and Syracuse won that one pretty easily. I think it was like 21-6 or something. So I probably will start betting more of these. And, but you're right. I just haven't bet as many. And I tend to just put them on my site for free the first week. I'm like, I only have 1 or 2 bets the first week. Here you go. I don't want to charge for those. There you go. And they win, which is good, because then people are like, oh maybe I'll sign up. So it hasn't.
We're in the same boat. We're in the same boat
because I should bet more.
The data's not there. You say, how come I have such a big difference on this week one game? I have a firm opinion, but I'm still scared. And it's just, you hate starting off on the wrong foot, or at least that's for me.
Maybe it's part of it. Yeah. I want to see a game, but the data says I should bet more, and maybe you've reminded me of that again.
Okay, well, it's food for thought, because
if I go 2 and 3, if I go 2 and 3 the first week, then I'll call you and bid you out.
Okay, I'll give you my unlisted number. Yeah.
All right.
The week 5 is a very big week for me, because when there used to be a 16-game schedule in the NFL, I always felt, wrongly or rightly, that coaches think in quartiles. The first quartile, the second, the third, the fourth. So even if your record is 1 and 3, or maybe especially if your record is 1 and 3, week 5 has been a high volume week for me. How do you treat taking your data and saying, okay, all whatever I thought in August doesn't matter now. I have 4 games of data. How do you treat your crossover when you move over?
The number of bets does go up. Week 5 in college and in the NFL is the week where the priors start to drop. The weight of my priors start to drop more. So week 5, I do think that there's definitely more bets in college in week 5, and there have been with the new model, I believe, more bets in week 5, starting week 5 in the NFL as well. And I do think a lot of that's because of now you have 4 weeks a day, and that's generally what it takes for the compensation models to start working really well. You need at least 4 games to let the compensation of all these predictive metrics start to really work. And trend wise, you mentioned the 1 and 3 teams. 1 and 3 teams off a loss in the NFL are, if they're playing a team off a win, are been good for decades.
That is correct.
I don't have it in front of me, but I'm guessing it's probably 58% against the spread for many years. 40 years probably. So it might be like, hey, we're 1 and 3. Like we go 1 and 4. That's bad. 2 and 3, you're right back in it. So there are some week 5 trends that I think are really interesting. I do pay attention to those. Like I said, I don't bet a game just because of a trend, but if my model likes a team that's going against a 1 and 3 team off a loss, I might be like, maybe we'll just make that an opinion instead of a bet, because I know the pattern. Week 5 is an interesting week, usually a good one.
How do you factor in? In my model, I always have a couple of teams that are just off the charts. and most of the people that I know have a similar issue. How do you rein in the rogue team stats that are just coming up? You just know that they're not telling the story of the team. How do you account for that?
Sometimes they do tell the story. I got a couple examples over my years and a few more in college. Well, I'll stick to the NFL because more people will remember this. Because I have what I think the team's going to be like going into the season, and then a team may be much worse or much better. The big example were the Rams in Kurt Warner's first year, 99, I believe, right? So they're expected to be a good team going in. Then Green gets hurt. Warner's the quarterback. No one knows. Now people are like, average team, maybe. And they start off 6-0, 6-0 against the number, beating teams by like 18 points a game. But the underlying, and it wasn't turnovers. Normally when you see that, it's the team is plus 10 fumble margin or some random thing going on. There was nothing random about what was going on there. And so I just forget what my prior was. This team is legitimately good. Now, if they're tracking at 14 points better than an average team, I think like the case was back then, I know that's not going to happen long term. The best teams in the NFL are 9 points better, 10 points better than the average team probably, generally. So I might drop them down, but they're still a lot better than the market had them, even after a 6-0 start. And they just kept on covering, kept on winning. The other example more recently is the Rams in Jared Goff's first year with the new coach after Jeff Fisher got fired. Goff was horrible his rookie season. I thought, all right, well, in the back of my mind, I'm like, well, Jeff Fisher cannot run an offense. He's got a 1970s offense. And Goff went to Cal, and I'm aware of what he can do. He's a good deep ball thrower, all this stuff that I saw, watching him every week. Like, we'll see, what the new genius can do with Goff. And as soon as they started out, I'm like, oh, good. I'm like, forget. And the Rams were not expected to be good that year, that first year, and they made the play. I think I went to the Super Bowl, right, the first year, with the new coach. And I thought, forget it. After like 4 or 5 games, I'm like, scrap the prior. Let's just base this team on the predictive metrics of this season only and not weigh the prior at all. So there are times when I'm like, when a team is very different, new coach, new quarterback, stuff like that, if I'm seeing something different than what the prior showed me or what I expected of that team, I'll look into it. And if it's not random, I'll ride with what's going on. You are what you are, as some famous coach said. And they are with them, and they were legitimately good. And there was value on the Rams that entire year because the prior in the NFL lingers on. You're wondering why a 7-2 team is an underdog to a 4-5 team in Week 10. That's because the prior says that this other team is that the 4-5 team is a better team. And sometimes that's the case, but sometimes you just have to look at it and go, no, they are what they are this year. Forget the prior. And you have to make those decisions based on experience. You guys probably are good at that as well because you were around during the time before all the analytics. You understand that. It's an art. Yeah. It's not just math. It's an art form, I think.
I use that exact same term in a write-up about Kansas City. I go, at some point, you got to stop being afraid of this team. They are what they have done and accept that. Go ahead, Ron. I know you're chomping at the bit.
So I want you to critique this next statement about home field advantage. I've kind of adjusted my ways for home field advantage. I've looked at, say, a MAC team. Say you've got Akron, and they're 0-9 or 1-8 or whatever. It's November. There's 485 people in the stands. I'm going to downgrade their home field advantage in November, where I may have had a different number in September or October. So I'm playing around with the home field advantages based on record, based on fan support and stuff like that. Am I wrong? What do you deal with?
I do not have team-specific home field advantages in football. I have found over the years, and there probably are. I mean, Hawaii might be an example of where the other team traveled however 3,000 to 6,000 miles to get there, and maybe that's there are time zones that matter. Travel is part of it. But in your case, let's say there's 500 people in the stands in November. How excited is the visiting team to play in front of 500 fans that don't give a shit?
Yeah.
You know, it might affect the home team, but it also probably doesn't pump a lot of excitement into the visiting team either.
That's a good point.
So I don't mess with it. Home in my college model, my home field advantage is dependent on the type of team you have. In college, going home and road, the difference between passing home and road is much more significant than running numbers. So teams that run the ball a lot are relatively better on the road than they are at home. Teams that pass the ball a lot are relatively better at home than they are on the road. And so I let the home field is cooked into each component, running, passing. So it might be 2.2 points in one game and 3.8 points in another game, just depending on the run-pass blends of the two teams. There are certain teams that I may bump up a little bit, if a team and college basketball, altitude's a big thing, and that's in the model, in my college basketball model. Altitude tends to create better home field advantages from teams from sea level, aren't used to the thin air, et cetera. Denver Nuggets, Utah Jazz, those teams have been good historically at home in the NBA relative to road. So that stuff's cooked into the basketball model, and I do it a little bit in college football. Just in the back of my mind, I might add a half a point for a team going up to Reno, to play Nevada.
Okay.
I might add half a point or something for that, but it's not cooked into the model, or I don't do team specific otherwise. In general, I just,
Well, excellent points, and I think that's something that's a really good takeaway in terms of how to deal with home field advantage.
And it's not that what you're doing doesn't work. I've just never done it. I've never done team specific home court advantage in football. I have in basketball, and I do in basketball, but a lot of, like I said, is based on travel and altitude. And so it's cooked in. Yeah. And some of it is based on style of play in basketball. Teams like the old Arkansas teams under Nolan Richardson that pressure a lot. They tend to be high pressure defensive teams, full court press teams tend to be relatively better at home because they're energized by the home crowd. And that stuff tends to rattle the opponent facing a press more than if they're facing the press at home. So teams like that if that's cooked into the model, pressure, turnover rates enhance the home court advantage in basketball automatically as part of the model. In football, aside from, like I said, teams that run the ball more tend to be relatively better on the road, and passing teams tend to be relatively better at home. Aside from that, I don't really have anything else in college. But your way may work. I've just never really tested it. I just do it the way I've done it. So I'm not saying your way doesn't work. I just haven't ever done it.
Your NFL went south for a little while, and you retooled your model.
Yep.
And I had to do the exact same thing when scoring elevated and various rule changes came in. How difficult of a process, and how much did you have to tweak your existing model to account for that, which you've been very successful since, as I have also. And then also a comment. I'm curious, how many inputs are you generally using? Because I've heard you comment that the more inputs, the worse it is. There's a dilution to them. Just curious on your perspective on that.
Well, yeah. Like I said, the NFL model was very similar to my college model for many years. It was really good for the first 15, 16 years of my career. I think for about a dozen years, it was 52%. And I was basically spending all my time doing college handicapping. I wasn't really updating the NFL model. And the same model was working in college. It was the same kind of model. But then I realized that the NFL, it's easier for the market to catch up to the NFL because more people are doing analytics in the NFL. And so then I thought, all right, I need to change my model. And I don't want to keep recommending bets that I no longer believe in the model. 52% is not good enough. So I quit the NFL for 3 years and like I said, hired a mathematician to work on a model with me. Same concepts though. Find out what metrics, they're advanced metrics, they're different metrics. It's not yards per play, yards per pass, all that stuff. It's success rates and EPA and pressure rates and all that stuff that play-by-play stuff you can look at now. What is predictive and what is not, and how does each of those things affect future performance? And now, there can be, if you have 50 variables, that may be a little, cooked in. It's probably maybe not good. It's probably a lot of overfitting. But the way the model is designed, nothing is backfitted in the way I do a model. I'll, choose, if I'm looking at past data and I want to break down a season and see how teams run, I'll choose the odd weeks, the games in the odd weeks, and create a model and then predict the even weeks based on that model and see how each of these metrics correlates to future performance. Or you do the first half of the season, project the second half, and you'll find out like, oh, that's kind of random. That's an important statistic in winning or losing. Like I said, turnovers, but it doesn't really lead to future value. So there's, like I said, it's just taking out the variance. It's finding what you can predict going forward. And because none of this stuff's backfitted, I can get a true sense of how well the model works. I mean, any model that anyone's testing, and it may not be as easy to, do what we've done, unless you're really good with a database, but maybe they're just testing, I've got all these stats and I've got a model. Well, leave some seasons out of your model. Choose some random seasons to not include in formulating your model. And then you come up with your model, then test it on the 3 or 4 seasons you left out. And then see how it would have done. And then you'll get an idea of how good your model is. But everyone's model, if they're using a regression to find a model, everyone's model is going to be back tested great because the data that they use to create the model, they're testing on that same data. So of course it's going to be good. Like I got a model and it's 62% against the spread back, when the difference is 3 points or more. I'm like, yeah, but that of course it is, because the data you're testing on is data you use to create the model. So of course it's going to correlate.
It's just so hilarious because you're so detail oriented and you go so deep in this stuff. And, so coming in, we're like night and day. And then from what I do, I use a hell of a lot of inputs. So, and you use fewer. So very
the NFL model has about 30 now.
I'm sorry?
The NFL model has about 30, but a lot of them are the same, but different game conditions. Like it might be early down success rates in competitive situations. You define what a competitive game is.
Yeah, but that's a human element. That's a human element.
Right. So you have to define that in your model and then you test it. But I might have early down success rate in another form in the model too. So like I said, it's 30 or so different variables, but a lot of them are the same, just in different conditions. That maybe doesn't make sense to a lot of people, but so maybe there's 15 legitimate things that are being used, but that's all I found. That was, you could have done 50 probably that have some statistical significance, but at some point it's overfitting, I think.
We'll bounce back to this. I know Ron's chopping at the bit.
Well, it's time to ask the question that Chris likes to hear me ask all the time. We talked very briefly before the show, and of course I got excited. I've said for years, no matter what guest we've had and so on, that special teams play and that is so underrated in terms of not just missed field goals and missed extra points, but protections and punt returns and so on. And it sounds like I have somebody on my side in yourself. So talk about how you put that in your model, if you put that in your model, and how you evaluate special teams.
Well, I see NFL special teams rolling across the bar at the bottom. In the NFL, it's a little more random. The talent level of the players on special teams on NFL teams doesn't vary that much. They're all elite athletes that have made it to the NFL. The best teams in the NFL might be 6 points better in special teams than the worst teams in the NFL at the end of the season. But that doesn't mean a team that's 4 points better than average in special teams through half the season is going to be 4 points better in special teams the second half of the season. It's more like 1 point.
Unless you're the Chargers.
1 point is value. 1 point that's value.
Right.
But you're talking about the elite teams. Most teams are within a point and a half, of the middle, and then projecting forward might be a third of a point, half a point. Most of the time, it doesn't matter. You talk about teams like back in the day when the Chicago Bears had Devin Hester and great field goal kickers and a great punter, and they really worked on special teams. They were good every single year. So some of it is the Patriots for a while were good every single year. At the end of the year, some teams are random. You might see a team that's plus 3 points per game in special teams halfway through the season and go, plus 1 going forward. But if it's the New England Patriots or the Chicago Bears back in the day and they're plus 3 points through half the season, they're legitimately plus 3 points because they've been that way for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. So it just depends on the team. In college, I think it's underrated in college because the guys playing special teams at Florida State or Alabama or Clemson are freshmen that are future All-Americans. These guys they're playing an average FBS team with the guys playing special teams are just not as talented. And it could be a big difference. You can have I've had times where, there's been like a 9-point difference in special teams value. And that's extreme, but it has happened in college. If it's, like I said, Akron or something, if Alabama's playing Akron, they're scoring a touchdown on special teams or they're doing something. They're blocking a kick. They're, the best team and the worst teams could be a huge difference in special teams in college. Now, same thing is how much of that is predictive going forward, how much of past special teams correlates to future special teams value. And I compensate my special teams ratings based on who you've played and how good the teams that you've played, how good they are in special teams. But there's still, it's not 100% predictive from half the season to the second half of the season. You have to kind of know about how that predicts, based on doing it for many years and understanding exactly how it predicts going forward. But there is more value in college special teams than I think people realize. I see a lot of guys doing college football metrics and they have their number one special teams in the country worth half a point. Like, you got to be kidding. I mean, the best teams in college football in special teams are at least 3 points better than an average team in special teams.
Yeah.
And they're maybe being valued a point better. Or, by a lot of guys in the analytics. I just don't see it. I have a special teams rating on every single game, an advantage, and I track that. I track everything in my model. And my special teams rating, if you just bet on the team that had the special teams rating advantage, you'd be like 52.8% against the spread blind. Any advantage, and that means it's not in the market. So I do think you just have to know how to value it and how predictive past, current special teams value is to future special teams value. And that's the trick. And I'm not going to tell you what that is. I did in the NFL, but I'm not going to tell you in college. But, you just have to study it. You have to understand it.
Yeah, there are techniques. There are a couple that I use, but that could be for another time.
And actually, a lot of times, coaches that punt the ball, just punting it is negative. You should be going for it. Like a team like Army is so much better than their stats because they go for it on fourth down when they should go for it on fourth down, and they don't punt a lot. Every single punt is negative expected points added almost. You're better off going for it on 4th and 8 from the midfield than you are punting.
Yeah.
But no one does that. But Army goes for it more than any team, and they might average 5 yards a play and give up 5 yards a play, and they're outscoring you by 6 points a game. And it's because they're going for it on fourth down. They just running 15 or 16 more plays than you are because they know when to go for it and not throwing away points by punting. So a lot of special teams going for it. It's just not punting.
Maybe it's catching up a little in the NFL because there are more 4th and 5s from the 40 that are being now, no, we're not going to pen them deep. We're going to actually go for it with the rules that favor quarterbacks, with the RPOs and so on, more 2-point tries. I think we're seeing a little bit more take off the shackles with the NFL offenses inside the 40-yard line.
Right. I think the younger coaches are not afraid to cite analytics And as older coaches and older sports writers sort of disappear, because it's why'd you go for it there on 4th and 5 because analytically that's what I should do. Well, that cost you the game. No, it happened to have cost us the game, but it was the right play. And like old school guys don't understand that, whereas the younger fans, younger people start to understand. You're not going to get criticized as much for it now as you would have 15 years ago.
Right.
So if you're making analytical decisions to go for it on 4th and 5 from midfield, 15 years ago, you would have been crucified. You would have been fired for such a stupid mistake, even though it was analytically correct. But now there are more people who understand that's the correct move. And so you're not going to get criticized for it as much. So coaches aren't afraid of the criticism. So they're doing what's right analytically more often. And Bill Belichick is one of those coaches who's been doing it for a while and gets criticized sometimes for it, but he's always on the right side on those choices generally. Even if he doesn't make it, he made the right decision analytically. But nowadays you don't get criticized for it as much, just because younger fans they're understanding of it. So you're seeing it more. And in the NFL model, the 4th down decision is part of the model. So if you punt when you should go for it, you get penalized. And if you go for it, even if you don't make it, you get rewarded. Because in the future, that's going to pay off. It didn't pay off that time. You went 4th and 5 from the 45-yard line, and you only got 3 as incomplete pass. Well, yeah, it didn't work out that time. But in my model, you get positive credit for that, and it will pay off down the line. The difference between the San Diego Chargers a couple years ago, they'd make such stupid 4th down decisions and stupid goal line decisions.
Wide variance.
And now they got a coach who understands analytics. Same talent, and now they're better. They're probably 4 points better just because of the coach, just because he understands analytics and he's willing to go for it. And he's willing to make the right calls on, goal line situations and where the other coach was an idiot. But that 4th down decision stuff it can separate teams now. You got old school and new school, and the